Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, this is always the season for wearing masks locally, but usually that stops by Ash Wednesday. We'll be looking at the latest on COVID tonight. Plus, remember the flu? We'll be looking at that too. There's been an upswing in crime at the same time that the New Orleans Parish DA is talking about a different approach to prosecutions. We'll examine that. We'll also look at Carnival adjusting to the times, as well as some of the latest political maneuvers. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; LeBron Joseph, news anchor and reporter, WGNO TV Channel 26; Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL TV Channel 4; and Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. We go over first to LeBron. And what's the latest on COVID? What are our numbers? Are people getting vaccinated?
Well, first off, the numbers, the governor is still very concerned, and we're averaging over 2,000 cases a day, which is not a good deal. In fact, today, 2,369, and still a couple dozen deaths a day being reported. I think the number today was 58. So statewide, it's not a good deal. Yeah. On the other side of the coin, I guess the most positive news we got this week is the Orleans Parish landing at 4% positivity, which kind of, going down from a 12% or whatever it was a couple of weeks ago. And so New Orleans moves to a modified phase 2. However, the surrounding parishes, still St. Tammany and Jefferson, over 11%, I think 9% or so in St. Bernard, 6% in Plaquemines. The biggest local parish, I think, or at least in our region, would probably be Assumption. They're at about 15% positivity. Also a big worry from the governor in that the UK strain or that variant of coronavirus is now in Louisiana, a couple cases, one of those cases being in New Orleans or in the New Orleans area as well. There's a lot of concern there and still a lot of unknowns as to whether or not the current vaccines actually protect against those new variants. Some early testing says yes. However, with the variant that's out of South Africa, which, by the way, is not here yet, is certainly in South Carolina, a couple of cases from folks out there. We haven't seen that here yet, but supposedly those variants are an awful lot more contagious. And it is a worry in that regard. You mentioned vaccines, and the good news is that people here are getting vaccinated, I should say. The 70 plus, the healthcare workers, the frontline workers. But we've got that bottleneck that the rest of the country is dealing with right now, insofar as us not having enough vaccines for people that want to get them. Next week, we've been targeted as getting more vaccines from the companies that provide them, and that should be a big week for us.
Right. Well, the state has been moving up in terms of our rate of vaccination. I think we're the 6th in the country, last I heard, and not doing these mass vaccination events at all yet.
Yeah, we're not doing those yet, although I've seen them take off in other parts of the country. I just don't think we've had enough vaccines or enough of the medication to be able to do that, to open the Superdome or the, Smoothie King Center or any of, Zephyr Field or whatever, to be able to have some cars lined up to get vaccinated. We just don't have the vaccine to provide that just yet.
And still we're on, as you noted, 70 and over, and healthcare workers, nursing home residents. We are seeing some vaccine hesitancy among some of those folks.
I did see that story, that among some of the folks that work in some of the senior care facilities, saying that they don't want or they're reluctant to take the vaccine, and the governor's office sort of shifting some of those resources in terms of the vaccines they have allocated for the nursing homes, that if people don't want those vaccinations, they want to be able to move them to people that are on these waiting lists. And there are waiting lists across the state, by the way. A lot of setup has been done to sort of lay the groundwork so that we can get as many folks vaccinated as possible. Unfortunately, we just don't have the vaccines just yet. And in many places, there are just waiting lists and waiting.
You're speaking of these variants, there certainly is concern because they are more easily transmissible. They're more contagious.
Yeah.
And so with that, there is the fear that the infection numbers obviously will rise. They're telling us now to wear 2 masks at a time.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that. It's interesting because Dr. Rachel Wrightan, who does some of the segments for us over at GNO, mentioned just the other day. She said, 5 masks is not better than 2, or 9 masks aren't better than 5. But, if in fact there is a way that you can wear 2 masks and it probably is better, considering that folks are using, lighter material for masks and things of that nature. So it's not necessarily a recommendation. However, it certainly beats not having a mask at all.
Yeah, that's, what I heard Dr. Fauci say. It just sort of makes sense. You have more blocking,
I can't breathe in one. I don't know how I do it too, quite frankly.
Well, the real important thing is wearing it correctly. Right?
Yeah. Over the nose and over the mouth.
Right. You can't have it hanging under your nose. That sort of defeats the purpose of it all.
That is correct.
So anyway, the governor, I know he's really emphatic. He said maybe slightly improving, but we aren't anywhere near where we need to be.
We are not out of the woods yet at all. It's a tough situation. And again, if we're averaging over 2,000 cases a day, and some days over the weekend, the Sunday numbers come back at 3,500, 36, that's still a significant number of cases in the state, which means there is community spread throughout significant parts of the state. Some of the parishes, the positivity rate being 15, 16, 18%. East Baton Rouge had some really big numbers, and even in northern Louisiana, in the Shreveport area, just huge numbers. And trying to just emphasize to people, hey guys, wear the mask, wash your hands, and all of these things that they've been saying for months, which we're all tired of hearing, and everyone has COVID fatigue, if you will, but this is saving people's lives. The only other thing I'll mention is with the modified phase 2 here in New Orleans, I really see the City Hall and the Mayor's office move of still denying the indoor service of bars, an attempt to sort of keep the numbers where they are and to keep them down, and even closing the bars through Mardi Gras, if you will, in an attempt to say, hey, we know that people are still gonna, we don't want you in groups, we don't want you out and about celebrating, people are still gonna do some things, but opening the bars would just kind of magnify that problem.
Don't let your guard down.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, LeBron. Don, over to you. Let's continue talking about viruses. Influenza, where is it?
Where is it is the good question. At this time last year, if you looked at the CDC's map of the United States, they do a color-coded where is the flu, and green, there's very little activity, and purple, there's a lot, and every color in between was on the map. Louisiana was in the orange or the red at this time last year. If you look at the entire United States right now, there's a light shade of green in Tennessee, and the rest of the map is dark, dark green, very, very little to no flu activity. I talked to Dr. Fred Lopez with LSU today, infectious disease expert, and he said it's just not there. It's lower than it's been in his memory. It's lower than it's been. Researchers who have looked at it say it's never, since they've been tracking flu, they haven't seen it this low. And that's in large part, they believe, due to the measures we're taking to prevent COVID. Hand washing, staying home when you're sick, and mask wearing. The flu is a respiratory virus. It's spread through droplets from your saliva or your spit, the same exact way COVID is spread. And because we're social distancing and we're staying away, you're not seeing it spread. I usually joke this time of year, have some beads and a little flu along with your beads. So maybe we're not going to spread it this year. Dr. Lopez says, but we're not out of the woods for sure. It usually peaks here between December and February, sometime within those months, so we're not past what could be the peak of it. And once flu gets rolling, it's hard to stop. We also, though, this year have had higher levels of vaccination rates than ever before. Usually in the United States, more than half of adults who are eligible do not get flu vaccines, and people are losing some of that vaccine resistance this year. You know, the double concern of, will the hospitals be full of COVID patients and not be able to accept the flu patients, maybe scared enough people in a good way into going to get the vaccine. The real question is, what would next year's flu season look like? And, you know, nobody has a crystal ball to say this is what it will be like, but the flu changes every single year. It mutates and changes and finds a new strain to come out with. And if we're relaxed on those social settings and we're not distancing as much anymore and we're not wearing masks anymore, the flu will spread just like it does any other year. So there are a number of people in the United States who have now said, guess what? I'm wearing a mask during flu season. We'll see. I know other people who are like, as soon as this ends, I'm throwing my masks away. I'll never wear one again. So will we educate the population enough, or will the population say, masks work. Maybe I'll just stick with my mask. Time will tell, I guess.
Is
If
flu,
you're not,
go ahead, Ian.
if you're not feeling quite right, how can you tell if you have the flu or the virus or
a common cold?
or a bad cold? Yeah.
You can't, but the real message therein is if you're not feeling quite right, don't go out. Don't try
Right.
to push through and go to work. Don't send your kid to school. Stop spreading them, and maybe everybody else can stay healthy.
Is flu a little bit harder to catch?
Flu, actually, there's science that says flu is easier to catch from children and harder to catch from adults, and COVID is the opposite. That's not completely researched out yet, but apparently the viral load that an adult walks around with COVID is much, much higher than the viral load a child has. And in flu, it's the opposite. A child has a much higher viral load, so children are the real vectors for flu. And since they're not necessarily all in school, or when they are in school, they're being masked, they're not spreading the flu to each other, and therefore kids to take it home and give it to mom and dad and grandmom and granddad.
Okie doke, so we continue wearing those masks. All right, thanks a lot, Dawn. Mike, over to you. Crime in New Orleans. We keep hearing so much about carjackings way up. What about other areas?
Well, it was not a great picture for New Orleans across the board, and it normally would get maybe a lot more attention, but we were, of course, in the COVID year and a lot of political upheaval, and in some ways, the story got a little bit, consumed by other major headlines. However, one thing that was quite interesting, we can start with homicides, which are always a high-profile crime category. There were 202 murders in New Orleans compared to 121 the previous year, 2019. Now, that's a pretty steep increase, but you have to take that into consideration that 2019 was a 40-year low at 121. So the Metropolitan Crime Commission put out a report recently that looked at the previous 4 years and compared 2020 within that 5-year period. And that was perhaps a little better indicator, to flatten out some of the extremes like the 2019 murder rate. And in that comparison, homicides were up 36% in 2020 compared to the previous 4 years. In other crime categories of violent crime, the numbers were also very sobering. We had shootings, non-fatal shootings, up 56% in 2020 over the previous 4 years. And then the real shocker were carjackings, which were up 90% over those previous 4 years. Kind of matching what we were seeing anecdotally with crime reports. Some of those carjackings often, turned into shootings and, made dramatic headlines. And they are borne out by the statistics that we are on a bad trend. Now, what is quite interesting is that COVID, with all of the precautions being taken, more people staying at home, did lead to a shift in some crime categories. For example, one of the major crime categories that was down were house burglaries. Those were down about 26%. But they were replaced by a much larger increase in car burglaries, up 39%, once again, 2020 compared to the previous 4 years. So clearly, with more people staying at home or not going on long vacations, leaving their house empty for a spell, would-be thieves were looking at, I guess, the easier target of cars. And once again, we know this anecdotally, having seen news reports of thieves hitting a dozen or more cars at a single time in a particular neighborhood. A very frustrating problem that seems to be widespread throughout the city. One other very interesting finding from this MCC report was that the violent crime, killings and shootings, were heavily concentrated in 2 police districts. A full 50% were confined to the 5th District, which is all of the 8th and 9th Ward, including Lower 9, as well as the 7th District, all of eastern New Orleans. So a very, very heavy concentration on the violent crime. Other categories of crime, far more widespread, especially those car burglaries. And interestingly enough, once again, sort of matching the, complaints that we hear on neighborhood, apps like, Nextdoor, they were hitting more upscale neighborhoods and Lakeview in particular. And sure enough, the third district, which includes Lakeview, had the highest number of those car break-ins. So once again, it's a troubling trend. Now we're very, very early in 2021, but so far we're not off to a great start. There is a lot of attention, and I do think that as we gradually pull out of the COVID pandemic emergency, that if crime stays at these stubbornly high rates, that is once again going to leap to a very big front burner issue for people who live in New Orleans.
Yeah, it really, and it's already really front burner for a lot of residents. I mean, we see New Orleans East residents really, publicly saying, we need help here. To the police department.
What we are starting to see are neighborhood groups and citizen groups calling for meetings, with the police department, with city leaders, with the council, wondering what's the plan? What is the crime fighting plan? Now, there were some, shifts in crime fighting within the NOPD announced late in the year, but if you're the victim, living in some fear, afraid to go out at night, you hear gunshots, routinely in your neighborhood, just a announcement of a plan isn't cutting it.
Yeah.
Citizens want to know what their officers in their district are doing today to keep a lid on crime.
All righty, Mike. Thanks a lot. Right now we're going to move over to Errol. And Errol, it is Carnival time, and even though COVID is stopping it, by golly, some people are going to celebrate in some way or the other.
Well, the different layers of Carnival time, there is that season which begins January 6th, but usually not much happens until the parades start happening. And this would have been actually the weekend. This would have been the weekend like when the Croix de Vue had its parade. And to the real Mardi Gras people, I mean, that's a really important parade to go see. Never has a parade theme fit the current affairs as well as the Croix de Vue's theme this year, which would have been "We Have No Taste," and that fits the Croix de Vue's character perfectly in terms of its satire. So, but what we're seeing, and then of course next week would have been the beginning of all the regular parades, and so we're getting into the thick of the season. If people are going to feel it at all, they're going to start feeling it now. If they had their own rituals, if they had their own crews, if they had their own parties that they went to, they're going to start feeling, well, none of that's there. And so, but what's interesting though is what is there, and usually sometimes hard times create creativity, and we're seeing a lot of that too. I think the most interesting thing is all of these porch floats, which we're seeing around town. And if you listen to everything that's going on, there's going to be a lot of them. So I think there's going to be people just driving around and looking at the porch floats. And I think some of them are going to be very, very creative. And I see this as being something that's going to carry on into the future. If neighborhoods could start organizing, imagine like a block, everyone with a creative porch float, and every year doing that. I think it'd be a good thing. And the other thing is what's happening in City Park with the floats and the oaks, which I think is another good idea. And there are some people who just can't physically or for various reasons go to a parade. But to be able to get in somebody's car and drive through and pass the parade, I think it's a good addition to Mardi Gras too. And so I think there could be some good things to come out of it too.
Mardi Gras, but that Mardi Gras spirit certainly continues.
Yeah,
in all kinds of creative ways.
But people are going to be glad to see the real thing back next year.
I think so, too. Thanks a lot, E. Mike, let's go back on over to you. And while we're talking about crime rate going up, we have a new DA in Orleans Parish, and he's got a slightly different approach than his predecessor.
Slightly different might be an understatement there. I would say pretty dramatic 180-degree difference from Leon Canizero. And this is interesting because it kind of runs in cross currents to the crime trends that we're seeing. But Jason Williams campaigned heavily on being a more progressive district attorney to, institute racial equity in prosecutions, to curb mass incarceration. And he has already taken some very early steps in fulfilling those promises. Number one, he recently announced that he would no longer send prosecutors to pardon and parole board hearings where inmates are seeking an early release either through pardon, commutation, or some other change in their sentence. That was something that Leon Canizero routinely did. Unlike a lot of other DAs, New Orleans has a big pool of prosecutors in their DA's office, and he spent those resources traveling all over the state to various prisons to almost uniformly contest pardon and parole relief. Jason said he is going to stop doing that. Now, it's an interesting position to take in that the district attorney works closely with victims of crimes, and usually it is the family, a victim themselves, or the family of a loved one who's been killed, who keeps, I guess, abreast of what's going on with a defendant's case, including sometimes years or decades later, a request for an early release. Jason Williams' response to that was that there are professionals on these panels, the pardon and the parole boards, to look at the circumstances, look at prison rehabilitation, and make those determinations without prosecutors weighing in on that.
And this,
now,
and this
one
is
other
let me just interject right here. Is that regarding violent offenses also?
All offenses, and it is usually the violent offenses, where we see the requests for commutations, especially everything from murder, armed robbery, and rape. In which are either victims or victims' families left behind. So yes, that would include the most shocking cases and some that are in many cases decades old, long forgotten by the general public and long forgotten from news headlines, but very much in the memory of family members left behind. Now, just real quick, one other policy that Jason Williams said he was implementing immediately upon taking office is the transfer of juvenile offenders to adult court to be prosecuted as adults. Now, last year, it was the middle of last year, completed a state law called Raise the Age, in which all 17-year-olds in both nonviolent and violent crimes automatically get prosecuted in juvenile court. 17-year-olds used to go to adult court, then it switched to, nonviolent 17-year-olds stay in juvenile court. Now, all 17-year-olds stay in juvenile court. And the policy of Leon Canizero was to take a big and hard look at juvenile crimes of violence in particular, to transfer what he called the worst offenders to adult court. Jason Williams says he will no longer be doing that. Now, obviously, there's always an exception to every rule, and I imagine that perhaps in some of the higher profile cases, and we have seen some shocking violent crimes at the hands of juveniles, I think that Jason Williams will be put to the test on whether to stick ironclad to that campaign commitment.
And some of these changes, what's the response from law enforcement community?
Now, law enforcement really hasn't weighed in. They have some concerns with the DA's office and with the criminal justice system in general, more related to offenders that they arrest getting out very quickly on low bond or release on recognizance. That's their immediate concern. And I do hear from officers who complain about arresting the same people over and over. Oftentimes on some of those lower level crimes, such as the car burglaries, we have seen that. We have documented that and done stories on people going through a bit of a revolving door, getting out on a low bail after a bunch of car burglaries, only to be arrested again for the same crime. That is what I think not always in the decision-making process of prosecutors as much as it is magistrate court and the criminal court bench. But it will be interesting to see when the time comes what position Jason Williams and his office takes on bail reduction and bail in general. Remember, a campaign promise.
So I'm going to have to move us on there.
One of those was the end money bail. Another campaign promise yet to play out. We'll see how he stands on that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. And let's wrap up with you, E, real quick, about some political goings on.
Well, there are several stories in the news about vacancies and the effort to fill the vacancies. The one closest to home happened with the Orleans City Council because of Jason Williams being elected DA. that left a vacancy in his at-large seat. And according to the charter, the way a vacancy on the council is filled is that the council as a whole votes to fill in the vacancy if there's less than a year left of the term. Well, yesterday they did. They elected a woman named Donna Glapion to be the new interim council member at large. The Glapion family is a well-known New Orleans family, especially in Black Creole society. It goes back a long time. Some people may remember her, a distant cousin, Roy Glapion, who was on the council at one time, who was also very, very active in the Zulu organization. And by the way, Donna Glapion was a past Zulu queen, and so she's well known in the community. It's a very, very established name. But according to the law, is that if you were appointed to an interim position, you can't come back and run for that position.
Right.
And so that's out of there. And she also announced when she was sworn in that neither will she go and run for one of the other positions. And so she's serving that period of time. And so that was all done kind of smoothly. The other thing is in the District 5 race in Northeast Louisiana, when we were on last time, the qualifying hadn't finished. Julia Letlow, who is the widow of Fluke Letlow, who had just been elected, signed up, and she seems like she's the front runner. A guy named Lance Harris, who was a state representative, was a guy who'd finished second to Luke Letlow, and he said right away that he's not going to run. And so the rest of the candidates are not people who are well known. And Ralph Abraham, who was the incumbent, has endorsed Julia Letlow.
Okey-doke. All righty, we're going to stick with you. Round table, other stories.
Back to Mardi Gras and people looking for ideas. That includes Channel 12. Monday night there's a premiere of a really neat program. It's called Mardi Gras Parades from the Past. It's done in a theater setting with 3 people sitting around looking at clips from old parades. And it's really good. There's a lot of interesting commentary and a lot of scenes and a lot of views of New Orleans that you hadn't seen before.
And you're one of those 3, right?
I'm one of those people.
Okey-doke, we'll be looking for that. Let's go over to LeBron now.
Today, the city of New Orleans has basically responded to some criticism about moving City Hall to the Municipal Auditorium. Apparently, we're under a deadline to use some money that FEMA has given us. If we don't use it, we sort of lose it. Of course, people in the neighborhood don't want to see that happen, but the city is setting up a website for public input.
All right.
We'll see more about that coming up.
All right, thanks a lot. Dawn.
Mardi Gras isn't just a New Orleans thing. This week we saw all the house floats hit the BBC and the AP. Next week, it's supposed to be Monday morning. Check out Good Morning America for a piece on New Orleans Mardi Gras and how we keep the spirit here in spite of COVID.
Okey-doke. Mike?
Yeah, when I was on this show just over a month ago, there were very high hopes for both the Saints and the Pelicans. Now we've seen the Saints take an early exit from the playoffs, and the Pelicans' start can only be described as disappointing. So 2 things to look forward to are the probable announcement of Drew Brees retiring, supposed to happen sometime after the Super Bowl, and look for the Pelicans to be a seller when it comes to the trade deadline in the NBA.
Okay. All righty, guys. Thanks a lot for joining us. Thank you all for joining us, too. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.